Imagine a mother in northern Nigeria clutching her children as the sun disappears behind the dusty horizon. There are no sirens to warn her, no soldiers to protect her, only the distant rumble of motorcycles carrying armed men who move from village to village like a wave of darkness. Families flee into the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Fathers stay behind hoping to defend their homes with bare hands against rifles that came from wars far beyond their borders. This is not a distant tragedy. This is Nigeria today. And the world's most populous black nation, once called the Giant of Africa, is now staggering under a wave of mass kidnappings and relentless attacks so widespread that terror has become a daily rhythm of life. President Bola Tinubu has declared a nationwide security emergency, yet the violence spreads faster than any government response can contain. What used to be isolated incidents is now a national collapse unfolding in real time. But what pushed Nigeria to this breaking point? And why, after years of silence, have global powers suddenly turned their gaze toward this crisis? The United States, through President Donald Trump, issued a threat unlike anything seen in recent memory, warning that America could intervene militarily, guns ablazing. The shock of those words rippled through every corner of Abuja. Yet, while all eyes focused on Washington, another superpower slipped quietly into the picture. Russia stepped forward, offering weapons intelligence and counterterror support, two giants pulling from opposite sides while Nigeria stands in the middle. So the real question is this truly about helping Nigeria, or is Africa once again becoming a battlefield for global influence? If you care about Africa's future, if you believe nations like Nigeria and Burkina Faso deserve dignity, sovereignty, and real solutions, please stay with us. And if you believe truth matters more than headlines, subscribe to join this growing community of people who refuse to look away. Long before global powers turned their attention toward Nigeria, ordinary families had already been living in a slow-burning nightmare. Picture a schoolyard in Niger State where laughter once filled the air. Today, that same yard is silent abandoned because hundreds of children were taken by armed men who arrived before dawn. Parents stand helplessly in front of empty classrooms, clutching photographs and begging for news that never comes. That single scene captures the reality of a nation under siege. Across the North-South and Middle Belt mass, kidnappings have become routine. Highways are patrolled not by law enforcement, but by gangs who block the roads, seize travelers, and vanish into the forests. Entire villages evacuate before sunset, knowing that once darkness falls, no one is safe. These events aren't isolated, they've become the daily heartbeat of a nation overwhelmed. For years, Nigeria dealt primarily with Boko Haram in the northeast, but something shifted. The violence metastasized into a complex web of threats stretching across the country. Boko Haram still operates, but now they share the battlefield with ISWAP, pushing from the Lake Chad Basin bandit groups, dominating the northwest kidnapping networks, thriving in the south, and resource militias fighting deadly clashes in the Middle Belt. Each group has its own motives, its own sponsors, and its own access to weapons. And the weapons themselves tell a deeper story. After the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya descended into chaos, and its vast stockpiles of arms spilled southward. Guns, rockets, explosives, military-grade hardware from a collapsed state began flooding into the black markets of the Sahel. Over the years, these weapons traveled across borders, changing hands again and again until they arrived in Nigeria. Today, it is not uncommon for bandit groups to possess weapons more modern than those carried by local police. As arms flowed in, Nigeria's youth faced growing desperation. With rising unemployment, shrinking farmlands due to climate pressure, and few economic opportunities, thousands of young men found themselves cornered. Some joined militant groups out of ideology, but many joined because it was the only way to survive. Kidnapping for ransom became a profitable business model, structured, organized, and efficient. Negotiators, intelligence gatherers, and well-armed units turned criminality into an industry. Nigeria's security forces simply could not keep up. The police were underfunded and understaffed, and in many regions response times stretched into hours, sometimes days. The military was fighting too many battles at once: terrorism in the northeast, bandits in the northwest, oil theft in the Niger Delta, and peacekeeping missions abroad. When a security system reaches its breaking point, criminals don't just move, they take over. That is exactly what happened. By late 2025, the pressure reached a boiling point. In October, a series of attacks pushed the situation into a full-scale emergency. The kidnapping of more than 300 school children in Niger State symbolized the collapse of security nationwide. News of attacks poured in from every region, villages raided commuters, ambushed farmers killed on their own land. It felt as if the entire country was being swallowed by chaos. President Bola Tinubu responded by declaring a nationwide security emergency, but the move was too late to calm the storm. The violence had already spread too widely and too deeply. Communities felt abandoned, and trust in government institutions eroded with each passing day. For many citizens, the fear wasn't just about the attacks, it was about what might come next if the country continued to crumble. And that is when the world finally turned its gaze to Nigeria. Not because the violence was new, but because it had reached a level that could no longer be ignored. What had been a national tragedy suddenly became a global crisis. Within days, foreign governments, think tanks, and intelligence agencies began to reassess Nigeria's stability and its impact on regional security. But while the world looked at the symptoms, few understood the roots. Few saw how years of economic hardship, political missteps, unchecked weapon flows, and fractured security institutions had collided to create the perfect storm, one so powerful it would soon pull the United States and Russia into direct confrontation on African soil. In the days after the mass kidnapping in Niger State, Nigeria felt like a nation holding its breath. Parents slept on school floors, refusing to go home without their children. Local radio stations played nonstop coverage broadcasting interviews with villagers who described armed men arriving with military precision motorcycles in formation, rifles, polished voices, calm and confident. It was clear these attackers were no longer ragtag groups. They were organized, trained, and equipped. And that was the moment the crisis reached its breaking point. Then came the shockwave that no one expected. Early one morning, Nigerians woke to a fiery message from across the ocean. President Donald Trump, speaking directly through a late-night Truth Social post, accused the Nigerian government of allowing mass killings of Christians. There was no warning, no diplomatic channel, no careful phrasing, only a blunt, explosive threat. He declared that if the violence did not stop immediately, the United States could intervene, guns ablazing. Those two words, guns ablazing, hit Nigeria like thunder. Within minutes, Abuja went into emergency consultations. International news outlets flashed red banners. Nigerian social media erupted. To many citizens, this was not a policy statement. It was a declaration of dominance, a reminder of how foreign powers had historically treated African nations. Some Nigerians cheered, believing American firepower could finally crush the terrorists. But many others felt a deep sting of humiliation. They asked, why would an American president speak about our country this way? Why threaten invasion instead of offering cooperation? Even within Washington, Trump's message rattled officials. Analysts warned that Nigeria is not a small nation where foreign boots can land without consequence. It is home to more than 200 million people, a complex security landscape, and deep political sensitivities. A military intervention could ignite a regional firestorm. But Trump's political base, especially conservative Christian groups, applauded his boldness, pushing the situation even further into global headlines. And just when the world was fixated on the United States, another superpower made its move quietly, strategically, and with impeccable timing. From Moscow, President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia was ready to assist Nigeria in fighting terrorism. Unlike Trump's threat, Putin's message came wrapped in the language of partnership and respect. Russian officials emphasized cooperation, sovereignty, and mutual interest. They offered concrete tools, advanced weapons systems, intelligence-sharing drone technology, and counterterror specialists who had operated in Syria and the Sahel. The contrast could not have been sharper. One superpower threatened to enter Nigeria with force. The other offered to support Nigeria on Nigeria's own terms. For many Nigerians, this difference mattered. It went beyond geopolitics. It touched national pride. On local radio call-in shows, callers asked why America spoke with anger while Russia spoke with restraint. Commentators compared the two approaches, noting that Russia had already built strong security partnerships with countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic nations that had grown increasingly frustrated with Western interference. Within days, Nigerian social media turned into a battlefield of opinions. Some users posted videos declaring that Russia respects Africa more than the West ever did. Others warned that Moscow's intentions were not purely noble, that great powers never act without self-interest. Still, the emotional resonance of Russia's approach was undeniable. It felt like a challenge to decades of Western dominance. Inside the Nigerian government, the mood was clear. Officials rejected the American threat as an attack on sovereignty. They insisted Nigeria would not be bullied. Yet they remained open to international assistance provided it came with respect. In closed-door meetings, diplomats expressed relief that Russia's offer gave Nigeria leverage. For the first time in years, the country had options. Meanwhile, the violence continued. The same week Trump issued his warning, new attacks erupted across multiple states. To frighten citizens, it felt as if the extremists were responding directly to global attention, pushing harder, striking deeper. Communities feared becoming pawns in a new Cold War fought on African soil. By now, it was undeniable the crisis in Nigeria was no longer just a security problem. It had become the center of a geopolitical tug-of-war, one that would test the nation's sovereignty, its alliances, and the balance of global power. As global powers traded statements and warnings, the people of Nigeria felt the consequences more deeply than anyone in Washington or Moscow could ever imagine. In the town of Kaduna, a grandmother sat on a wooden stool outside her home, whispering prayers as gunshots echoed faintly in the distance. She had survived civil unrest, economic crises, and years of extremist violence, but this moment felt different to her. It wasn't just criminals on the move anymore. It was the uneasy sense that Nigeria was becoming a stage for something far bigger. Across the country, ordinary citizens feared that the crisis was slipping out of their hands. Villagers worried that Trump's threat of an American military intervention might provoke militants to escalate their attacks. Parents kept children home from school, unsure whether classrooms were safe or potential targets. Even transportation routes, usually lifelines connecting communities, became corridors of dread as drivers canceled trips and highways emptied before sunset. Politically, the pressure on President Bola Tinubu intensified. His declaration of a nationwide security emergency, though intended to demonstrate control, was widely seen as a reaction to events that had already spiraled far beyond the government's grasp. Critics accused the administration of responding too slowly, of ignoring early warnings, and of underestimating the scale of criminal networks that were expanding across multiple regions. Supporters defended the president, but conceded that Nigeria's security institutions had reached their breaking point. Inside government ministries, the American threat created shock and anger. Officials saw it not only as an insult, but as a direct challenge to Nigeria's sovereignty. Many recalled the painful history of foreign interference in Africa, moments when powerful nations used security assistance as justification for deeper political control. For them, Trump's words revived old fears that Africa was still viewed as a place where decisions could be forced from outside. But the reaction among Nigeria's citizens was more complicated. In cities like Lagos and Abuja, some celebrated the American statement, believing that outside intervention might finally end the violence. Others strongly rejected the idea, worried that foreign soldiers on Nigerian soil would only worsen an already fragile situation. Religious leaders added layers of emotion. Some felt grateful that Christians were being defended, while others warned that framing the crisis as a religious conflict could ignite sectarian tensions that had been quiet for years. Still, it was Russia's offer that produced one of the most dramatic shifts in public sentiment. Many Nigerians, frustrated by decades of Western involvement that seemed to produce few results, viewed Moscow's tone as respectful and cooperative. Russia's promise of weapons intelligence and counterterror training felt like a lifeline, especially when compared to Washington's threat. On social media, phrases like "Russia treats us as equals" began trending, revealing how deeply the emotional contrast resonated with everyday people. But this emotional divide created new political fractures. Nigerian lawmakers found themselves split into competing camps, those who believed America's tough stance might bring discipline, and those who insisted that Russia's partnership offered a better path forward. Cabinet meetings reportedly grew tense as ministers debated which direction Nigeria should lean. Diplomats quietly warned that choosing one superpower over the other could reshape Nigeria's alliances for decades. Meanwhile, on the ground, the violence did not pause for politics. Attacks continued in remote regions. Families fled burned-out villages. Kidnapping gangs struck in new territories emboldened by the chaos. To citizens, it felt as if extremist groups were exploiting the political turmoil, testing how far they could push while the government was distracted by international drama. In the end, the crisis produced a painful truth. Nigeria was not only fighting militants, it was wrestling with the weight of global influence. What should have been a domestic security issue had transformed into a political contest between superpowers, leaving Nigeria's people to endure the consequences while the world watched. From the outside, it may have looked like Trump's warning came out of compassion, but to those who follow America's foreign policy, his sudden concern for Nigeria raised more questions than answers. Inside Washington, officials privately admitted that Nigeria's collapse would be catastrophic for U.S. interests. Not only is Nigeria Africa's largest democracy and economy, it is also a central hub in America's counterterror partnerships. If Nigeria failed, the entire West African security architecture the U.S. helped build could collapse with it. U.S. strategists were also alarmed by something else: the speed at which Russia had gained ground in the Sahel. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, three countries once firmly engaged with Western alliances, had all shifted toward Moscow. Their governments rejected French military presence, criticized American interference, and began inviting Russian advisors, weapons, and training. Watching these shifts, many in Washington feared a domino effect. Nigeria, with its huge population and energy reserves, would be the biggest loss of all. This fear intensified reactions inside the U.S. policy community. Some analysts argued that Trump's threat was not truly about protecting Christians, but about protecting American influence. Others believed he was appealing to his conservative Christian base voters, who strongly support foreign intervention framed as defending the faithful. In either case, Nigeria became a stage for domestic American politics long before it became a subject of humanitarian concern. But while the U.S. debated its next move, the rest of the world was watching just as closely. European leaders expressed unease, not because they disagreed that Nigeria faced a disaster, but because they feared destabilizing Africa's largest population would trigger migration waves across the Mediterranean. France, already weakened in West Africa after its exit from Mali and Burkina Faso, viewed Russia's growing presence with alarm. Germany pushed for diplomatic restraint, warning that foreign intervention in Nigeria could ignite a broader regional war. Meanwhile, Russia's move was interpreted very differently across the global south. Leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America saw Moscow's offer as symbolic, a message that Western powers no longer had a monopoly on global security assistance. The world was shifting. Nations now had choices. And the tone Russia used, calmer, cooperative, and free of threats, deeply contrasted with America's approach. Across African capitals, diplomats quietly acknowledged that the balance of power was changing. Countries like South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya observed that Nigeria's situation reflected a larger pattern: global powers competing for African partnerships, resources, and military alignment. To many on the continent, this was an opportunity, a chance to negotiate better deals, assert sovereignty, and avoid being forced into old patterns of dependency. Within Nigeria itself, this global conversation became incredibly personal. Citizens listened to world leaders speak about their country with a mix of pride, frustration, and fear. Pride because Nigeria finally mattered enough for global powers to compete over. Frustration because foreign debates often ignored the human cost on the ground. And fear because every foreign statement seemed to provoke new anxieties. What if Nigeria became another battleground in a global rivalry? What emerged from all these perspectives was a single undeniable truth: the world is no longer unipolar. Africa is no longer silent, and Nigeria is no longer a passive player. It stands at the center of a reshaped global order where superpowers must compete, negotiate, and adapt. As the dust settles over the events of these past weeks, one truth becomes painfully clear: Nigeria is standing at a crossroads not just of security, but of destiny. What began as a wave of kidnappings and violent attacks has now expanded into something far bigger: a struggle over who gets to shape Africa's future. And in moments like these, the lives of ordinary people often disappear behind political speeches and grand strategies. But if we listen closely, we can still hear them. A mother in Borno who prays for her missing son. A farmer in Kaduna who wonders if he will see another planting season. A school teacher in Niger State who stares at empty desks and wonders whether her students are still alive. These voices, fragile yet resilient, remind us that Nigeria's crisis is not a chessboard. It is a human story, a story of families, of dignity, of nations fighting to reclaim control over their own future. And that is where the deeper warning lies. Because the moment the United States issues a threat and Russia responds with an offer, the danger grows that Nigeria's suffering will no longer be about Nigerians at all. Instead, it becomes a magnet pulling global powers toward confrontation. We have seen this before in Syria, we have seen it in Libya, and Africa has paid the price each time foreign interests collide on its soil. But something has changed. Africa today is not the Africa of decades past. Nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, through the drive for sovereignty, championed by leaders such as President Ibrahim Traore, have shown the world that African states will no longer accept decisions forced upon them. They will choose their own partners. They will define their own future. And yes, Nigeria, too, has the right to stand tall and say, "Our destiny is ours." So now the question extends beyond Nigeria. Will Africa allow itself to become a battleground for superpowers again, or will this be the moment when a new era of sovereignty finally takes root? And for you, our viewers, many of whom have lived through the Cold War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and countless geopolitical storms, your experience matters here. You understand how quickly conflicts can spread, how rapidly outside involvement can escalate, and how easily powerful nations can misjudge the consequences. So we ask you, do you believe Nigeria should trust the United States? Should it accept Russia's offer? Or is it time for Africa to follow its own path, just as President Ibrahim Traore has urged, choosing independence over influence? Your perspective matters more than you know. If you believe Africa deserves the right to decide its future, if you believe that sovereignty is not a privilege but a birthright, if you believe that truth must outshine fear, then please share this video. Let this message reach those who still think Africa is silent. And subscribe if you believe, as we do, that the truth is more important than the headlines, and that nations like Nigeria and Burkina Faso deserve to stand tall in a world that is finally becoming multipolar.